It smelled of vinegar, honey, and old wool. In the narrow courtyard, where towels from the hammam were drying on ropes, adult neighbors argued, staring at the dust at the foot of the steps. In the house opposite, a husband explained to the elders that his strict measures were supposedly therapeutic, that illness was treated with discipline in bed, not words. Behind the wall, clay cups clattered quietly. A healer from the neighboring row sorted boxes of anise and pistachio seeds, and a clerk from the community office already held a pink notebook under his arm, because the case was moving from the courtyard to the court. All adults know the price of shame and rumors, and they all understand that the term medicinal punishment often hides what should not happen in the community. By evening, the rabbi would be summoned, and he would bring not harsh words, but books, a set of rules where the body and desire are analyzed in terms of health and moderation, not fear. Hello, friends. You are watching a channel of documentary stories about law, health, and human decisions. Right where you are watching us from, geography always changes the nuance of meaning. Leave a comment. Where do you see the line between faith and medicine, between custom and coercion? I wish you peaceful and thoughtful listening. The city lives to the rhythm of markets and prayers. A caravan clatters at the gates. Water flows through the alleys. And in the houses, on clay shelves, are stored the two pillars of this story: scrolls with laws and narrow medical treatises. The rabbi, who will be called upon to settle the dispute, did not invent new grandiose formulas. He opened what the community has been reading for decades: codified laws describing the duties of spouses and the limits of physical power over each other, and the medical advice of Moshe ben Maimon, the very scholar who lived a difficult life as a doctor and teacher, and left behind texts on healthy routines, moderation, and bodily dignity. There are no colorful words about shame and disgrace. Instead, there are lists of habits for day and night, food and sleep, baths and walks, and how physical balance is destroyed by extremes, by excess and cruel abstinence, by overeating and exhausting trials. The community scribe was used to other prose, books of fines and contracts, but now he listened attentively. The dispute concerned adults and touched on the boundary between care and violence, between religious customs and medical advice, between the myth of the holiness of the whip and a document that speaks of health without hysteria. The courtyard whispered about old methods, as if adult cruelty could be a cure. The rabbi laid out the papers, and in this paper silence, the first crack in the myth became particularly clear. There is no place for therapeutic charia in the codified norms of adult married life. The responsibilities are described dryly and precisely: bread, clothing, respectful living, care for physical well-being, the right to intimacy in a manner consistent with health and work capabilities, not punishment. Where courtyards like to talk about the right of the strong to correct morals, The law responds, coercion is not a cure. Any mention of harsh measures leaves the legal realm and becomes a violation of peace and dignity. It sounds like a dull bureaucracy, but in fact, it is a strong thread that holds broken families together. Because without it, any for the sake of recovery turns into the exact opposite. The medical side argues otherwise. Maimonides spoke of moderation as a medicine for the mind and body, but not through punishment. In his health regimen, the day begins with exercise, light food, and clean water. Desire is controlled not by shame or the whip, but by routine, food, rest, and the safe closeness of adults who are attentive to their strengths and condition. He warned of the dangers of extremes, how exhausting abstinence undermines mental clarity and causes anxiety, how excess destroys strength and makes a person a slow shadow, how sleepless nights and heavy spices heat the blood and spoil sleep. These are simple things, but they are precisely what save us from those methods that sometimes cover up everyday cruelty. Where the whip is habitually called a remedy in the courtyard, the medical book responds with a schedule of sleep, baths, and walks, clean air, and a ban on violence as a source of disease. The community court listens not because it loves soft words, but because it knows the price of a bed where fear lives instead of peace, and the price of mornings when pain and heaviness fall heavily on the working week. The elders in such cases are not always villains. More often, they are guardians of dark inertia. They are afraid that if therapeutic strictness is banned today, tomorrow the boundaries will collapse. They think in terms of examples. They say that weakness cannot be allowed because it will be followed by gossip from neighbors and the gradual decay of everyday life. The rabbi responds not with words about feelings, but with references to documents and practices that do not smack of shame. The code of conduct does not give an adult the right to torment another adult for the sake of morality or treatment. There are verifiable obligations, a level of maintenance, provision of clothing and housing, respectful closeness rather than punitive. There is the right to a court that will stop domestic aggression. There is reliance on medical advice, where health is measured by sleep, pulse, food, and a measured daily routine, rather than bruises and silence after shouting. When the elders talk about bad examples, the rabbi brings up another memory, lists from the fraternal fund, which show the costs of treating adults who were driven to illness by extreme shame and deprivation. There is no rhetoric in these tables, only money and weeks when a person did not work because correction was breaking his body. The myth that religion supposedly forbids everything and loves to punish in the bedroom falls apart in the face of facts. In codified laws, the married life of adults is protected from outside interference, precisely because dignity is considered part of the world. People are required to exercise reasonable care, not theatrical asceticism. The rabbi turns to another chapter, where moderation is called the central path that the mind and body follow. There is no place on this path for trials where one adult makes another a guinea pig under the guise of purification. And when the opponent recalls old stories of punishment for the sake of conscience, the rabbi responds with verifiable evidence. Outpatient records of adults with anxiety, insomnia, and weight loss after fasting imposed without medical supervision. Notes about breakdowns that occurred after weeks of discipline. Testimonies about how shame grew and strength waned in such homes. All these things sound boring, but for the community they are survival. A hospital bill is more convincing than shouting. In such cases, the court is not a spectacle, but a procedure. Adult witnesses confirm that the pressure was disguised as talk of treatment, that punishment was declared a mandatory course, and that attempts to refuse were called bad influences from the city. The community scribe turns the page and writes down not the shouting, but the facts. When, where, by whom, what was claimed, who saw the signs of pressure, who heard the promises to reform. Next, the rabbi pulls out another thin book, a medical regimen, where not only polite words are prescribed for the adult body, but also practical things. Clean air, moderation in food, restful sleep, a walk before dusk, a visit to the bathhouse, a ban on sudden extremes, especially under the guise of religious strictness, because extremes destroy stability and make a person dependent. This is the second twist in the debate. It turns out that the religious tradition, which was referred to as the source of punitive methods, actually supports the medical idea of moderation, not everyday cruelty. At the elders' table, quiet words about the fear of bad example can be heard. But the world does not live by fear, but by rules. Codified laws point to the right of an adult to respectful intimacy and the obligation of another adult to provide it without violence. To household duties, where care is measured in bread, clothing, and time, not humiliation. To the procedure for going to court if the home has become dangerous. There are no invented formulas for therapeutic punishment. There is another option: temporary removal, a conversation with a doctor, a routine to reduce harm, support from the brotherhood, where expenses and days when a person cannot work are taken into account. The elders frown at the word expenses, but it is money and business that force them to abandon the myth. The community pays twice for aggression, with the bodies of adults and with coins. This means that the community has the right to prohibit anything that ruins its health and its finances. The debate then moves from the courtyard to rooms that smell of leather bindings and vinegar. The rabbi unfolds lines about desire, and in them there is neither the glorification of abstinence at any cost, nor the justification of disorder. It is all about proportions, how age, work, climate, food, and habits regulate the rhythm of adults' intimate lives, how duty does not turn into a demand when health is at stake, how vows and extremes break and moderation heals. These lines are not embellished with sermonizing phrases. They are closer to a medical chart, which notes that vitality returns not from humiliation, but from a stable, calm order. For courtyards accustomed to living by myths, this sounds like a cold shower. It turns out that it is not the whip or shame, but clear practice that makes a home livable. The community court imposes temporary measures that are not theatrical. Adults share their daily lives sufficiently to relieve pressure. The doctor prescribes a schedule for sleep and meals, baths and walks, and the rabbi establishes the obligation to renounce therapeutic punishments as actions that have no religious basis and harm the world. Alongside this lies another obligation, not to deprive another adult of respectful intimacy under the pretext of strict promises, if health and work allow for a normal rhythm. The third crack in the myth opens up here. The community, relying on religious norms and medicine, protects not someone's capricious freedom, but the stability of the home, where adults do not become objects of experimentation. And no matter how much the dark imagination is drawn to images of cleansing cards, the document and the health regimen say exactly the opposite. At the end of the day, the scribe sprinkles sand on the fresh lines, and at the bottom of the page appear cold words about the consequences for attempting to continue therapeutic punishments, punishment for disturbing the peace and undermining dignity, with the information being passed on to the city council, for spreading myths about the religious necessity of charis, a warning and a demand for a public retraction at the gates of the community house, for sabotaging medical regulations without reason, the obligation to appear before a doctor and a rabbi for explanations. These formulas sound dry, but they capture the essence. Adults will live according to reason and the law, and their bodies will not become a battleground for others' struggle for power under the guise of morality. Night brings coolness. The boilers in the hammam cool down, and the courtyard, where in the morning there was whispering about therapeutic strictness, empties. Scrolls lie on a bench by the wall, and if you look closely at their lines, you can hear the air changing. This is not a fairy tale about an iron religion that punishes all living things. Here is a quiet, persistent dispute between myth and document, between fear and order, between the convenience of the strong and the health of adults. The rabbi who brought this silence did not speak loudly. He placed books on the table where the body is not a shame or a weapon for education, but a gift that requires moderation. And the first day of this affair ended not with victory or shouting, but with a breath. The house where in the morning they sought justification for therapeutic carry received instead a piece of paper, a routine, and a boundary that cannot be crossed, because beyond it, the disease begins again. By the afternoon, it became clear that the dispute had spread from the courtyard into every crack of community life. People argued quietly in the shops, discussed strictness in the queue for the bathhouse, as if it were a seasoning for soup, and asked the fraternal fund to set aside extra money for unforeseen medical expenses. The scribe laid out scrolls and notebooks on the table so that different worlds lay side by side. A code of conduct for adult spouses, health guidelines with warnings against extremes, the Brotherhood's expense books, which already contained entries about ointments, herbs, and nights when volunteers sat by the bedside, watching the patient's breathing. The rabbi did not frown or raise his voice. He worked like a doctor, taking a pulse. First, the law on bread, clothing, and respectful intimacy between adults. Then the rules of moderation. Then the dry language of accounting showing the price of habits that people like to justify with the words rules and revival of conscience. Between these pages, the first myth was broken, that religious norms require strict discipline in the bedroom. There are no such words in the code, and the rules of health state directly. Extremes corrupt the mind, destroy physical stability, confuse desire with punishment, and turn the home into a hospital ward with no hope of peace and quiet. The court recorded the evidence because it knew the value of empty lamentations. If the conversation is not tied to paper and physical stability, old habits will take the place of reason. The elders initially clung to the defense of fear. They spoke of bad examples, of weakening discipline, of the fact that without strictness, people would ruin their lives. They could be understood. Rumors of debauchery are always voracious and easily turn into a reason to wage war on one's own home. But the rabbi laid out another memory on the table, one not prone to exaggeration. The rules of health teach that overly strict vows and voluntary deprivation are harmful, especially if they disrupt the sleep and nutrition of adults. Moral tone does not override physiology, and the codified laws that the community has adopted as its measure clearly state the duty of respectful intimacy and maintaining peace at home is not subject to punishment. It lists bread, clothing, time for rest, and intimacy, not levers of damage. If an adult hurts another adult under the guise of purification, they step outside the legal field and into the realm of peace violation. These lines sounded without anger, like a dry wind. But it was they that cut off the last reason to refer to, well, it's been that way since time immemorial. While the dispute dragged on, the first folder with medical notes was brought to the office. Outpatient notes from a brotherly doctor about anxiety, insomnia, and weight loss in adults after weeks of discipline that someone had imposed at home. The scenes were not described, only the symptoms, the regimen, the decoctions, the expenses, and the days when the person was unable to work. The folder was accompanied by statements with calculations. Each such week costs the community coins and energy, and the house loses stability because the adults are not doing their work. This was the second turning point. Money made visible what had previously been argued in terms of morals. The bill and the calendar are more convincing than fables. The myth of therapeutic strictness turns the community into a hospital, and brotherly hands into a permanent night watch, where sleep should have been. At that moment, the husband, whose methods had sparked the argument, tried to draw on stories from distant neighborhoods where honor was supposedly saved in this way. He cited old tales and fragments of sermons that spoke of moral purity. The rabbi responded with the same cold precision. Tales are not sources, but fragments, without an author or verification. Sermons that call for extreme strictness to the detriment of the body and the world go against the order of health and against the codified duty of adults to live without violence. He reminded them that even in strict seasons, religious books stipulate exceptions for the sake of preserving health, and where abstinence is prescribed, moderation and care for the weak are also prescribed. In the myth versus paper battle, paper won. Not a single source, recognized by the community, was found where therapeutic punishment was the norm. Everything that was presented turned out to be either hearsay or private opinion without weight. The court recorded, "There is no religious basis for punishment for the sake of treatment." The most prosaic, and therefore the most convincing, was the third twist. The rhythm of adult life together is enshrined in law, not by punishment, but by an order that takes into account labor, craft, and strength. In the old pages, the sages argued, but agreed on one simple thing. Rhythm is not universal. It depends on the severity of labor, climate, and roads. And in the codified version that the rabbi relied on, this boils down to one thing. Duty is not the same as coercion. A request is not the same as leverage. Refusal on health grounds is not the same as infidelity. And neglecting a respectful relationship without reason is a violation for which the court can shame and oblige one to comply. None of these points translates into a right to punitive discipline. Instead, each one translates into an obligation to negotiate, to see a doctor, to reorganize one's life so as not to ruin it. Translated into the language of the courts, this means that a spouse is not treated with humiliation, and fatigue is not remedied with a whip. The community court imposed measures similar to a boring masterclass on home restoration. The adults divided the space to relieve pressure, introduced a sleep and meal schedule, mandatory visits to the bathhouse according to a schedule, daily walks, a ban on nighttime arguments, and any demonstrative vows that destroy health. The rabbi recorded in writing the rejection of therapeutic punishments as an action that had no religious basis and was harmful to peace. The elders, who feared setting a bad example, received a program of instructions in return to explain in their sermons that moderation is not indulgence in weakness, but discipline of body and character, prescribed for the sake of life, work, and clarity of mind. To tell adults about the harm of extremes without bringing shame upon them. Publications at the gates were banned. The community refused to feed the market with the shame of others. Instead, they organized a series of closed discussions for adults, where health regulations and codified norms were read aloud and explained without shouting. Clan habits did not give up so easily. The next evening in the bathhouse, people began to talk about how strictness had allegedly slackened. The bath attendant, accustomed to confessions in the steam room, just shook his head and put a scroll with the new rules on the shelf. Discussing other people's homes without the right and knowledge is tantamount to a violation of peace. The guard at the gate of the community house was given the right to write down the names of those spreading malicious rumors and summon them for explanation. Several adults who tried to push their version of therapeutic discipline cooled their tongues after the first punishment. At the bottom of the sheet with the decisions, there was not only a ban on punishment, but also a new line of defense, a ban on rumors covered by the word jealousy, and a restriction on public shame where personal scrutiny and medical schedules were sufficient. At the same time, the health regime took control of both the apartment and the wallet. The Brotherhood allocated oil for rubbing after the bath, certain herbs for infusion, and 2 clean sheets with the doctor's notes appeared in the case. Change the time of dinner, reduce heavy spices, add an evening walk on warm days, get up earlier, and go out into the light. To people accustomed to counting, it looked like a child's routine. But the healer recorded his weight and breathing. After a few weeks, peaceful sleep returned, anxiety receded, and the house stopped creaking like an overloaded cart. There were no miracles in the schedule. There was the discipline of moderation, which the rabbi brought about through documents. And this is where the 4th myth, hidden deeper than the others, was broken. That respectful intimacy and health are things that do not concern the community. It turned out that they did. When adults live according to a schedule of moderation, the expenses for endless night vigils and potions for nervous tremors disappear, and working hands return to their craft. The court brought the case to a conclusion that seemed too calm for such a heated topic. Adults were prohibited from any bed punishments under the guise of treatment. They were obliged to follow a healthy routine, taking into account their craft, the season, and their strength. It was determined that refusal of respectful intimacy, without reason, was a violation subject to correction without violence and without shame, and that imposed abstinence and punitive severity were subject to immediate intervention. Established the right to see a doctor without intermediaries and without fear of public humiliation. Introduced a fine for public rumors about someone else's home when used as a means of pressure. All these measures looked like the decisions of a carpenter rather than a preacher. Straight lines, even seams, no carved patterns. No victory stories were hung on the door of the community house. Instead, a short notice for adults was posted there about available consultations, the bathhouse schedule, and the rules for dealing with nighttime disputes. Returning home, the rabbi paused to look at the shelf, where the scrolls with codified laws and health regulations lay. He understood that tomorrow new stories would come crawling in. Someone would again call humiliation a cure. Someone would again hide behind the word jealousy. Someone would ask for an exception to everything. But the community had developed a course of action from which it was not necessary to deviate. This time, the myth versus paper argument had been dismantled to its core. The myth was empty and toxic, while the paper proved to be heavy and alive. Adults ceased to be the subject of domestic experiments because their bodies, their sleep, and their right to respectful intimacy were protected not by shouting and restraints, but by texts that are the same for the strong and the weak, and by a routine that heals without drama. At night, the sounds of the late market could be heard in the alleys. and the stones cooled in the hammam. The house where the argument began smelled of oil and warm water, not fear. The scribe sprinkled sand on the last lines and closed the pink notebook. He didn't need to come up with lofty words. It was enough to see how, instead of therapeutic strictness, simple order had settled in the house, how adults talked about sleep and food instead of punishment, how those who had gone to instruct yesterday stood silently at the doors. These changes were not a miracle, but the result of precise formulas. It is precisely such formulas that make a community alive. Not the roar of victory, but the weight of paper that is trusted when it is necessary to push away a stranger's hand. By evening, new scrolls with the characteristic smell of vinegar and grated nuts lay on the table of the community office. Lists of visits to the bathhouse, records from the pharmacy, entries from the fraternal fund, where expenses for decoctions, oil, and night shifts at the bedsides of adults were recorded. These boring papers connected the distances between the shop, the hammam, and the house of prayer more closely than any sermon. It turned out that the dispute over therapeutic strictness now affected everything. Someone stopped going to the bathhouse on schedule, hiding behind vows, and got an inflammation of the chest. Others, on the contrary, began to mark the days of exemplary fasting, and brought themselves to tremors and insomnia. The pharmacist complained about endless requests for strong medicines, with which adults tried to drown out their anxiety after home lessons. All this was not theater, but the prose of life. And the rabbi deliberately brought these details to light because a document always begins with the small things. He arranged the scrolls so that the center was not filled with rumors, but with verifiable facts. The codified duties of adults in the home, health regulations with warnings against extremes, and expense books where the price of habits ticked steadily in the lines. At the same time, what always comes out in the shadows crept out of the courtyards. Whispers about miraculous practices, about straps that supposedly sober up and heal, about night vows that are used to demonstrate jealousy. It was not religion or medicine, but a market of fear. Cheap amulets with pseudo-inscriptions and straps with patterns never seen in recognized books were already lying in the tavern rows, and in the corner someone whispered for a penny about old methods that remained in stories. The rabbi did not argue with his voice. He pulled out some papers on the table and began methodically separating myth from source. There is no hint of treatment through humiliation in the codified laws. They list verifiable obligations, bread and clothing, respectful intimacy without coercion, protection of peace in the home, the right of an adult to seek help without shame. The health regulations are even more dry. Moderation in food, clean water, baths, walks, sleep. A ban on sharp extremes, especially those that are covered up by piety, because extremes destroy stability and a sense of proportion. There is no punishment there, just as there is no blessing for belts and nightly displays of power. These pages did not seek to please, they were created to prevent breakdown. Next to them lay the records of the brotherhood. Each of these methods cost the community coins, time, and hands, and turned the house into a quiet ward with no hope of rest. The elders clung to the ladder like a railing in a slippery corridor. If we soften the strictness, they said among themselves, the example will spread and reach the young people, and then stories will begin that cannot be contained. The rabbi responded with the same dryness with which a doctor lists symptoms. Religious norms preserve boundaries, but do not bless beatings. They limit harm, but do not increase its severity. The same codified chapters on which the community relied required moderation and prohibited humiliation under the guise of education. They defended the right of adults to respectful intimacy and safety. They prescribed household duties in accordance with health, labor, and time. He added another layer that is rarely mentioned until trouble looms. The community is accountable to the city. If scandals and nighttime screams begin in the neighborhood, if rumors of treatment with the whip spread, the city court will demand order and impose penalties on the entire community. This was not a theological argument, but a political one. The religious courtyard has walls, but they stand in a big city where peace is more valuable than habits. And this reality left the elders with less room for excuses. Then the case turned to where myths usually suffocate, to names and seals. The community scribe brought 4 sheets with well-known sermons, which the proponents of therapeutic strictness liked to refer to. They were read and set aside. None of the recognized texts justified humiliation or punishment in the bedroom. On the contrary, where abstinence was mentioned, exceptions for health reasons were also mentioned, and where order was called for, peace at home was called for. There was also something quite awkward. Several quotations used to intimidate people in taverns turned out to be fabricated, with altered endings and inserted words that had never been in the recognized lists. The crude deception was based solely on fear. The scribe recorded the source, the copyist, and the shop where it was found, and the elders nodded. The myth had interfered with life with forged papers and would be punished. The next day, the guard removed 2 moral discipline notices from the board at the gate and sent the amulet merchants to pay the treasury. No scenes, just the rusty grind of habit. The medical part of the case entered the house like warm air in the evening, imperceptibly but tangibly. The doctor, to whom the rabbi sent adults without intermediaries, filled out a series of short schedules: reduce salt and hot spices, add daylight, return to the bath on schedule, move conversations to the early hours, and prohibit nighttime discussions. He insisted that the rhythm of respectful intimacy in the adult home should be based on strength, climate, and work, not on ostentatious vows. Where someone referred to fragility after illness, the doctor prescribed gradualness. Where someone was frightened by their own susceptibility, the doctor explained that moderation is not a removal of strictness, but constant work on habits. After a few weeks, there were fewer new entries in the Brotherhood's cash register about ointments and decoctions for nighttime anxiety, fewer records of headaches from lack of sleep, fewer requests for leave from work due to fatigue after discipline. Boring statistics are the third and heaviest weight on the scales. When adults live according to a schedule, the hidden taxes of fear on the community disappear. Against this backdrop, another old trick emerged, an attempt to shift responsibility onto someone else's house. Several adults close to the proponents of strictness brought stories about their neighbors. They said that there was also lawlessness there, and therefore the methods worked as a preventive measure. The court did not go along with sensationalist stories. It recorded the complaints in a separate list and sent them through the usual channels. If there is violence somewhere, it is investigated as violence and does not justify punishment in other people's bedrooms. The rabbi explained that religious norms do not turn someone else's sin into a license for domestic violence. Once again, the myth tried to pass itself off as order, but it turned out to be only a shadow, pointing to a habit. Meanwhile, the city authorities reminded the community of an ancient agreement. The neighborhood is obliged to maintain peace and health within itself, so as not to spill noise and disease onto the streets. A messenger appeared in the office with a note from the magistrate's office which dryly stated, "Nighttime noises and complaints are subject to citywide penalties." In response, the rabbi and elders sent a copy of the decision. Medicinal punishments are prohibited as having no religious basis and harming peace. Health regulations are mandatory to the extent possible. The right of adults to respectful intimacy is protected without the use of violence, and rumors are punishable as a violation of peace. The magistrate returned a brief sign of agreement. Politics and religious norms were aligned this time, and the myth lost its room for maneuver. Prose without shouting returned to the house where it all began. There was no more whispering in the hallway, no more jingling of keys at night, and the cheap straps and pieces of paper with fake quotes were removed from view. All that remained was a shelf with recognized scrolls, massage oils, and a bath schedule. Stability always looks boring, and that is why it outlives myths. Adults who yesterday still believed in useful fear are now slowly getting used to a different discipline, treating anxiety not with threats, but with early sleep, restoring cheerfulness not with deprivation, but with normal work and walks, negotiating intimacy not as a war, but as a joint order, where respect is the foundation of health. This does not reduce the fever for the sake of propriety. It brings the house out of its fever. The rumors did not die immediately, but they lost their bite. Twice, the guards issued penalties for salacious retellings of other people's misfortunes, which were passed off as lessons in morality. The third time, the guards forced the amulet writer to withdraw all his merchandise and leave a receipt at the gate, stating that he would not spread the discipline of straps. The pharmacist stopped selling strong potions at night, and the bath attendant hung a sheet at the entrance with a schedule and a short warning about silence after sunset. All this was not very similar to spiritual uplift, and that was precisely where the strength lay. Order should not resemble a burning torch. Otherwise, it will quickly burn out. The most important thing that the community learned from these weeks was not in solemn words, but in a new skill of reading one's life like a book, looking closely at the codified duties of adults, at the health regimen, at the expense books, and at the silence of the night, which either holds or collapses. The myth of a religion that forbids everything and heals with a whip was thoroughly debunked in these lines. It turned out that religious norms preserve boundaries and enforce respect in the home, while medical knowledge teaches us to keep hunger and desire in check without humiliation or extremes. Everything else is a market of shame that feeds on fear and curiosity until it is forced to pay. Adults ceased to be objects of domestic experiments, not because someone's tenderness awakened, but because paper and routine tied up arbitrariness, and the city quietly reminded us that peace is more valuable than any demonstrative methods. Towards the end of the debate, the rabbi quoted a line that many liked to repeat, but rarely read to the end. Moderation is not weakness, but a form of strength in which the body and mind do not fall apart. It requires work, not blows, discipline during the day, not storms at night, nutritious food, not sweet revenge in bed. This idea transcends all cities because it is made up of things that are not sold in the marketplace: pure water, early light, silence after sunset, oil for rubbing, a small number of spices, and a ban on arguments when the body is tired. It also transcends methods because they cannot be fought. They are removed one by one, deprived of their literary shadow, commercial profit, public attention, and right at the gates. When the last prop disappears, the method falls silently. In the scribe's pink notebook, the last line was dry. The case is closed. Measures are in force. Re-examination after the agreed period. Consultations are available to adults without intermediaries. For those who love fireworks, this is nothing. For the community, it is the very heavy brick that holds the dam in place. Life stood beyond the threshold. Crafts buzzed away. The bathhouse smoked in the evening. The pharmacy smelled of herbs, and only near the amulet shop hung an empty string, on which straps and pieces of paper with false quotations had recently swayed. Their absence became the best sermon on a healthy order that does not shame or torment, but restores breath to adults, leaving myths in their only honest place, dust on the shelf. By the time of the second inspection, the ink on the old lines in the fraternal cash register books had almost dried up, and new columns had opened up. They listed oils for rubbing, warm water for the bath, infusions that the doctor prescribed to adults as best he could, and notes about walks at sunset. The scribe laid out these papers next to the codified duties of the household and the health regimen, like laying a level floor on loose soil. Salt, which the pharmacist used to dry the paper, crunched between the pages, and in the corner, by the grate, sandals rustled quietly. The guard had brought in new names of those who disturbed the peace with nighttime conversations about other people's beds. These names belonged to adults, each with a trade and bills to pay, and now they had to read the preventive lines as carefully as they had once listened to courtyard tales of therapeutic strictness. The community court held its line without shouting. This is how you stop a leak before the water has time to break through the bank. At this time, the old familiar fog returned. The market threw up a new wave of amulets and rewritten instructions where a printed hand promised quick order in the house for a penny. The shopkeeper displayed ribbons with invented formulas, and at the bottom, in small print, were other people's names, as if someone wanted to pass off the forgery as authoritative. The rabbi responded with the same methodical dryness. He asked the scribe to collect the recognized lists and place them side by side, sheet by sheet. The comparison killed the trick. The fake words did not match the texts that the community had relied on for years. The books, where physical moderation was on a par with daily discipline, refused to accept the whip under the guise of purification. The codified duties of adults in the home continued to insist on bread, clothing, respectful intimacy without coercion, peaceful disputes, and the right to go to court and see a doctor. Health guidelines pointed to clean water, baths and sleep, careful eating, and a ban on extremes, especially those that break the body under the banner of piety. The market had to close its shop. The amulets were removed. The copyists were recorded in the Book of Violations of Peace, and the money went to the treasury. This time, the myth did not crumble in the dispute. It was swept away with a brush like dust. Meanwhile, in the house where it all began, the adults rearranged their routine as the doctor had advised. Earlier meals, fewer heavy spices, scheduled baths, walks until sunset, and silence after candles. The fraternal fund allocated a little oil for rubbing, and a short line appeared in the doctor's notes about the alarm being removed and sleep returned. The one who had turned discipline into punishment now took home a schedule and the obligation to follow it, rather than looking for new levers. There is a certain harshness in this, not ironclad, but constant. The rabbi sealed the changes with a short addition to the decision: to consider therapeutic punishments absent in the religious and medical corps, and to suppress them as a violation of peace and dignity, to involve a doctor at an early stage of anxiety, to prohibit discussion of other people's lives on benches and at the doors of bathhouses, equating the dissemination of moral lessons with pressure. The community guard did not ring the bells. He simply wrote down, summoned, and issued penalties. And after a few weeks, the empty lines in the Book of Violations remained unusually long. The elders, who feared bad examples, received not a slogan, but a curriculum in response. Instead of threatening announcements at the gates, they read short talks to adults about healthy living, where moderation was explained as work, not indulgence, warm water as a remedy for nighttime heaviness, early light as an antidote to daytime gloom, the bathhouse as a way to release excess heat, food without extremes as a support for a clear head, respectful intimacy in the rhythm of work and climate as protection for peace in the home. There was no sweet sadness or relish in these talks. There was a table that adults could take away with them to their craft. Thus, the last pillar of the myth, its appeal, disappeared. When people received a clear outline instead of a frightening legend, even those who loved to quote it for the sake of power stopped believing in the legend. Closer to the season of cold winds, the court conducted a scheduled review of measures. The clerk brought 4 bundles to the table: recognized texts, doctor's medical notes, brotherhood expenses, and a list of quiet courtyards where nighttime quarrels had disappeared. The picture became even clearer. In places where they had previously sought justification for therapeutic strictness, they now recorded a decrease in spending on sedative decoctions, the disappearance of night shifts, and the return of adults to craft production. In those city neighborhoods where such measures were not taken, the thread of expenses and empty days still stretched on, and the magistrate sent his people there with a stern reminder. The world is shared, and the noise of the nights cannot spill over the walls. The community court used this political weight as a shield and as an argument. Religious norms, medical measures, and urban discipline stood in a single line, and there was no place for myth between their shoulders. Meanwhile, the doctor insisted on something the courtyards did not like: a slow, steady check without drama. He asked them to keep short personal logs: how they sleep, what they eat, when they walk, how they react to insults and fatigue, how they negotiate intimacy without turning a request into an order and a refusal on health grounds into guilt. This practice was accepted without enthusiasm, but it was accepted. Adults were given a strip of parchment, and the rabbi added to the decision the right to bring these sheets for consultation without intermediaries. Where yesterday people were afraid of the word doctor, they now came as if to a shop where tools are repaired, without shame, without secrecy, with hope for restored work and peace. The doctor's notes often repeated the same phrase in a dry manner: moderation preserves the home. However, myths rarely die at the first blow. After a while, news of a new mask came from the far end of the neighborhood. Someone began to call punishment heart fasting, covering the old with a new word. The court had a short formula for such cases: changing the name does not change the essence. If an action breaks peace and dignity, it falls under the previous ban and punishment. The clerk made another addition to the book: fasting of the heart and similar pseudonyms are to be considered an attempt to circumvent the decision. The guard summoned the adults involved, had them read the recognized texts and medical records, and imposed a fine for disturbing the peace. No shouting, no public demonstrations. The myth tried to rename itself and stumbled. The rabbi concluded his long line of work not with applause, but with a final set of arguments that no longer needed anyone's charisma. The codified duties of adults reflected a basic order. A home is sustained by bread, clothing, respectful intimacy, and peaceful reasoning. Coercion does not heal, it destroys. In Maimonides' health regimen, the doctor repeated at different times of the year, keep warm, get enough sleep, avoid heavy spices and late meals, walk, breathe, do not torture the body in the name of piety, because torture breeds disease. In urban discipline, there is a monetary equivalent of these truths. Where the whip is raised for the sake of purification, spending increases, and week after week, craftsmanship sinks. Different fonts have come together in a single line. The myth of a religion that forbids everything and heals with a stick has turned out to be alien to recognized texts and deadly harmful to the living. The final session was short because the long work had been done earlier. The court confirmed the complete ban on therapeutic punishment and any of its pseudonyms, upheld the right of adults to consult a doctor and a rabbi without intermediaries, confirmed the bath schedule and rules of silence, and affirmed that refusal of respectful intimacy without reason should be corrected through order and consultation, not shame and pressure, and that imposed abstinence is tantamount to the destruction of peace. For spreading rumors, they designated an empty corner by the gate, not for shame, but for mandatory explanations to those who liked to teach others. The magistrate received a copy, the pharmacist received a revised list of medicines not to be sold at night, and the bath attendant received a new sheet with a schedule and a warning about fines for noise. The scribe sprinkled sand on the lines and covered the decision with a heavy wooden ruler so that it would not be tampered with. In the evening, the neighborhood breathed like a workshop after a long renovation. The smell of warm stone, the sweetish steam of the bathhouse, quiet conversation at the door, where they talked about oil prices and tomorrow's order, not someone else's bed. In the house that had been the start of a difficult conversation, the adults were tired of being proud and tired of being ashamed. What remained was work, the usual bread, the usual silence, a neat sheet of schedule by the lamp, and a small bottle of oil, carefully saved for cold evenings. On the shelf nearby lay texts, venerable and alive, where desire is not stigmatized or exaggerated, but placed in the right frame, just enough, and just where it preserves health. The rabbi passed by without stopping. He had done his part. He had stripped away the gilding from the myth and restored to the community the right to be treated not with shame and fear, but with proven moderation. The doctor closed the outpatient notebook on a blank page, a rare luxury. The guard removed the extra word from the threshold and put it in the book of violations, where an empty line is now more important than any filled one. When the markets quieted down at night and the water in the pipes fell silent, the neighborhood did not become holier than it had been in the morning. It became quieter and more stable. And in this silence, the main outcome could be heard. Adult bodies ceased to be a field for foreign power under the guise of morality, because their health and intimacy were defended by documents and regulations that did not shout. The myth was returned to the shelf where it belonged, to gather dust in anticipation of the next reader. The paper remained on the table, heavy, imperturbable, ready to heal again with what it does best, removing unnecessary violence from life so that people have air, sleep, and the opportunity to say yes or no without risking their dignity. At last check, everything looked ordinary, as if the dispute had not affected the neighborhood. A short note about the order of silence hung at the gate. A clean schedule stone lay in the bathhouse. The pharmacy smelled of cumin and lemon peel, and on the scribe's desk lay the very same pink notebook with empty lines. A rare luxury for a community accustomed to paying for the habits of others. The guard reported on the silence without words of victory. The doctor brought a dry note, saying that there were fewer restless nights, and the rabbi placed another thin bundle next to it. Excerpts from recognized texts, where the body and desire are restrained not by the whip, but by measure and reason. Everything that happened here concerned only adults, and that is why every word carried the weight of responsibility, not theater. The elders asked for one last thing, to make sure that the ban on therapeutic punishment did not turn into an invisible loophole. The court added a short formula to the decision, without any pathos. Any renaming of old cruelty with new words should be considered an attempt to circumvent the order. Complaints should be accepted without intermediaries or shame. Health regulations and codified duties at home should be considered equal instruments of peace. This dryness proved stronger than any speech. It did not require faith, it required action. Sleep, eat, work, wash, agree on intimacy within one's means and without leverage. If anyone wanted to build a pedestal of words again, they were met with paper. The house where it all began became like dozens of others in the neighborhood. A lamp at the threshold, oil in a small vessel, a neatly folded sheet of schedule, silence after sunset. Those who had previously justified cruelty now carried a doctor's note in their pockets and remembered the price of someone else's insomnia, recorded in the Brotherhood's cash register. The neighbors stopped eavesdropping. The guard punished those who traded in rumors, not those who came for help. In the shops, people argued again about wool and pepper, not about other people's lives. No holiness, just order. Outside the neighborhood, the city also responded. The magistrate noted that there were fewer complaints and added the community to a short list of courtyards where peace was maintained without ostentatious reprisals. This did not bring any awards, but it did bring what all the work had been done for: the right to live without outside interference in the most vulnerable part of life. Where myths about purifying severity had previously propped up the power of the strong, there were now 3 simple pillars: recognized texts, medical regulations, and city discipline. They are not loved for their dullness, but it is precisely this dullness that keeps the water behind the dam. Sometimes the myth returned in conversations at the bathhouse, like any old song. Then the rabbi did not argue with words. He laid out the facts. The obligation to provide bread, clothing, and respectful intimacy to adults without coercion. The prohibition of humiliation under the guise of treatment. Permitted measures for the sake of health. The right to a trial and to a doctor without shame. The doctor added his own points. Moderation as work, not as indulgence. Prohibition of extremes. Warm water, early light, silence at night. Ordinary food without demonstrations. That proved to be enough. The story lost its voice, and the paper became heavy again. The ending was not beautiful. It was clear. The community court upheld the ban on therapeutic punishments and their pseudonyms, upheld medical prescriptions, and the right of adults to respectful intimacy without coercion, approved the order of silence and the bath schedule, and opened a direct path to the doctor and the rabbi, without intermediaries and shame. The fraternal fund reduced its expenses for night shifts, the shops regained their craft time, and the book of violations of the peace appeared with the usual empty line, and it became more important than any long instructions. The myth of a religion that forbids everything and treats with a stick lost not only its luster, but also its support. There was no place for it in recognized texts, no benefit in health regulations, no tolerance in city discipline. In the evening, the courtyard cooled down. Warm tiles hissed in the hammam, towels dried on ropes, and the air smelled of clean water and oil, not shame and fear. The rabbi put away the sheets, the doctor closed his notebook, and the scribe placed the pink book on the shelf, not for the sake of memory, but so that next time he would open it less often. The finale was settled by human decisions: to renounce violence under someone else's name, to recognize moderation as a deed rather than a slogan, and to keep the peace with documents rather than shouting. Everything else was dust on the shelf, which the community had learned to brush off without malice or drama.